Welcome to Underwater CSI International Revealed with your hosts, Senior Investigators Rich Morin and Ed Miron.
I'm your host, Senior Investigator Rich Morin, and with me today is my co-host,
Senior Investigator Ed Miron.
Ed, how you doing today, bud?
Not too bad, Rich. You?
I'm doing great. Basically, we're a show on underwater crime scene investigation. We've been doing it for 37 years, over 700 cases under our belts. Ed and I together have well over 20,000 dives under our belts. So we've been doing this a long time, Ed.
Yep. It looks like you've done a lot of those dives. The wear is starting to wear on you.
Well, you got the face for radio, let me tell you. Well, anyway, we have a special show for you today. We're going to be talking about a cave recovery that we did many years ago, probably 20 years ago now.
Yeah, easy.
And we'll just say it was in a northern state of the United States, very cold conditions. I think water temperature was roughly 38 degrees, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, and it was a deep recovery.
Yeah. So we're going to give you an opportunity to kind of participate a little bit and play along. If you want to get a pencil or pen and some paper, you can take some notes and see if you can figure out what happens, because we're not going to give you that part right off the bat. We're going to wait till the end and put our conclusion together. So anyway, our goal overall, as far as the show goes, is to get enough interest, because Ed and I recently, we were negotiating with two different networks in regards to a television series. They wanted a 36-show series contract, and after negotiations with them, when we got closer to actual contract time, it just kind of, things flipped a little bit. They wanted to change our market audience, and they wanted to change the premise of the show and basically try to make it like every other CSI show out there. But ours is unique because we do it all underwater. So what happened was, toward the end of it, as we're getting closer to contract time, the big guns start coming out and the nails start coming out, and, the fingernails, and they wanted complete ownership, and they wanted complete control and everything else. And we decided to walk away. So that's why we're starting the podcast here, hoping that we can get enough viewers interested, where we can start getting enough interest, where we'll do some reenactments of these shows. Like I said, we wrote 36 shows for the television networks, so that we can start doing reenactments and possibly put it on a YouTube channel or get another network to get interested in it. So please, if you like our show, share it, tell all your friends, family, tell all your fellow divers, etc., to listen up. If you don't like our show, then keep it to yourself. But anyway, what we're going to start off with today is we're going to talk about a cave recovery that we did about 20 years ago in a northern state. This particular, just to kind of give you a little premise of what the show is going to be about, we have two divers. One's a certified cave diver, the deceased. The other is a certified scuba instructor, recreational scuba instructor, who was a survivor. It was in a cave system. The victim was found 456 feet back inside the cave system. And what was the max depth on that, Ed?
It was about 116 to the bottom.
Yeah, that's where we found the victim, right?
Right.
And just to give you an idea of the size of this particular cave where the victim was found, now there were restrictions that, you had to go through in order to get to this particular area. But where the victim was found on the floor at 116, the ceiling was at
about 72, 74 feet.
Yes, we had about a 44-foot difference.
Correct.
Between the two.
Right.
So just to kind of give you an idea. Anyway, the survivor ended up with severe decompression sickness, and we needed to interview the survivor at a recompression chamber. We were on the outside talking to him, trying to get as much information.
Which was not the easiest thing to do.
Absolutely. The person's hurting, not only physically, but also emotionally.
Correct.
Because, allegedly they were very good friends. It happened early in the season. It happened in the month of May. And again, we're talking about a northern state. So, those are diehard divers that are doing something like that in those cold conditions.
Right. Very cold conditions.
Yep. So basically, overall, what happened is the survivor claimed that they had a equipment malfunction. They had a free flow regulator. And they went up to their dive buddy, who was this certified cave diver, signaled him that something was wrong, and secured the alternate air source. All right. Began the egress. Okay. Kind of hard, fast. And during the egress, the survivor said that the the hose all of a sudden started getting tugged back, and they were kind of like tugging back and forth, and he's holding on tight in order to maintain or retain the regulator. A little while longer, next thing you know, the hose is directly below them. They are at the ceiling of the cave now,
Right.
with the wall to the right side as they're trying to egress. The hose is directly behind him, and it's getting too heavy for him to hold on to. So he ended up releasing it, securing his free flow regulator, which was still going off at this time, managed to get the free flow back, got to the shaft, and did a rapid ascent to the surface at that point.
And that's where he got hurt,
Right.
that rapid ascent.
Yeah, and the victim never came out.
Correct.
So we got the call. And again, I mean, we're not in the area right away, and it's going to be an investigation. So we have to put a team together, certain divers, et cetera, and equipment that we need for this particular type of recovery, and then head on up. Plus, we have to interview the survivor. The day that we plan on doing the recovery of the victim, we had a local fire department, EMS service that were there. We had a state trooper that was there, and we briefed everybody. And what we told them was that, okay, listen, here's what's going to happen. We're going to be underwater a long time. This is going to be a long stage decompression dive for us, okay? Once we recover the victim, we're not going to bring the victim and hold them as we're doing our multiple hour ascent and we have to do all the stage decompression stops. We're going to go ahead and send the victim to the surface. Upon reaching the surface, nobody touch the victim, because we want to know chain of custody. We want to make sure that nobody messes or adjusts anything as far as the equipment goes, or disturbs any of the equipment, or equipment disappears, etc. So nobody is to touch the victim. After our ascent, we will go ahead, Ed and I will handle the victim. That way we know the chain of custody was just the two of us, and we will actually load the victim into the coroner's vehicle.
Right.
Right. And then from there, it's us and the coroner. That's it. Those are the only people that have made contact with the victim. So that was the plan.
Right. And when you talk about the length of the dive, it's just not the dive itself. It's all the investigative work at the time when we're down there with the victim.
Absolutely. Which can take a long time. We have photography, videography, all the forensics, the initial investigation, the note-taking, all of our placards that we put down for possible evidence that we're going to recover, et cetera. So it's a lengthy process.
Right. Now we also have our egress from the cave and then our ascents.
Yeah, not only that, but imagine the equipment we've got to bring in. Not only do we have to bring in all of our forensics equipment, we also have to make sure that we have adequate gases in order for us to do a safe egress out, including all of our stops that were required. Those tanks, what we did is we secured them on our ascent line so that we didn't have to be concerned about those as we were trying to do an egress with all of our equipment. Now we also have a victim.
Correct.
That we're bringing out.
Right.
So it's a lot of work and a lot of stuff to go over. But let's give you a rundown on what's going on here. Again, this happened in May 20 years ago in a northern state, back inside of a cave system. Now, the cave system wasn't a single cave. It actually spider-webbed out into multiple caves. So that was another thing that we needed to do when we were interviewing the survivor. We needed to try to find out where, okay.
And what cave system he was in.
Absolutely.
Right.
And, it wasn't that familiar to us. So it was something that we were, making sure that we're not going down tunnel systems that are going to just
have to be.
Yeah, that we don't have to be in burn up time and precious gases and stuff. So we go ahead after the initial interview. All right, we come up with our dive plan, et cetera, and we go ahead and we begin our descent. We end up finding the victim 456 feet back, 116 feet in depth.
Correct.
Now, once we find the victim, everything's just starting at that point.
Right.
We don't make contact with the victim at all yet. What we're doing is we're photographing everything from all different angles, and we have to light it up because what's it like down there, Ed?
Yeah, it's pitch black. It's darkness that you can't even imagine. You can close your eyes as hard as you can, and you can still see light. Here, there is no light, zero.
Yeah, we turned our lights off. It is just completely black. So when we found the victim, now we have to light up the area. and then we have to begin our initial investigation. One of the first things that we noticed is that the victim was on their back, rolled slightly to the right side, feet elevated, so they're more up toward the upper part of their shoulders. Right, feet were elevated. They had a little bit of air trapped into the dry suit. Okay, they were wearing a dry suit. In the lower part of the legs, which is now the high point. So basically, from just above the knee to down by their feet. Okay, so that was elevated a little bit. The arms were up a little bit, but appeared to be a dry suit squeeze. But the other thing that we noticed, Ed, was as far as the silk goes.
Oh, yeah. It was just the peppering of the silt.
Yeah. So on the body, we just had a light peppering of silt instead of heavily laden.
Right.
And when we looked around the area, the rest of the floor was not disturbed as far as silt goes, other than where the victim landed. So what does that tell us?
Yeah, it's telling us that obviously there was not a lot of other activity on the bottom, and that the peppering was just caused by the victim hitting the bottom gently, and then that peppering coming up and laying on the body.
Yeah, so as that silk cloud comes up, what happens as it settles back down, it's kind of like taking a pepper shaker and just lightly peppering your mashed potatoes or something, So that light peppering and the fact that there was no other disturbance along the bottom is telling us something already.
Right.
And that's telling us that whatever happened didn't happen here.
Right.
It happened somewhere else in the cave system. Now we have to find out where and why.
Right.
Okay. So otherwise, if it happened there'd be a big disturbance on the floor. Okay, as far as the silt goes, and the
there'd
body,
be a lot more silt.
Yeah, it'd be heavily laden with silt.
Right.
On that. All right. So that's one of the things that right off the bat, it tells us whatever happened, we've got a lot more investigation to do.
Right.
All right. So as far as the a victim goes, what we do is we photograph from every possible angle we can get to. And we attempted to videotape, but you got to remember, this was 20 years ago. We didn't have GoPros, right? We didn't have the type of equipment that's available now. We had the old big giant canister that your camera would fit into, and the cameras were quite large, and the big external booms that came out that held your lights on and stuff. So big, bulky equipment. The problem was with the pressure, pushing on the switches.
Right. Once the switch was depressed,
we couldn't operate anything else because it wouldn't retract because it's spring-loaded.
Right.
So that became an issue. So now we had to rely solely on
all the photography.
Yeah, just all of our pictures.
Right.
Now, what happens when we get back to headquarters and we get into the briefing room or debriefing room? Both, we have a whiteboard up on the wall. We have two projectors. One projector will project a tic-tac-toe board, right? Also a cross, also a vertical line, and a horizontal line, all separate. Okay. The other projector will project the photographs. So we take a photograph. All right. Let's say, for example, hey, let's just choose one and we'll go over it with them. Let's take photo one. Okay. So we'll take photo one. Now we can only discuss what we see in photo one, because if we get to court, we've got to testify in court. We can't go, oh, and this happened. Well, they can't see it. It's got to be what they can see from that particular angle. We'll have a better view of it from another angle, but let's go ahead and we'll just discuss one photo.
And
now we had.
Let me just interrupt you for 1 minute. So in a lot of these things that we see in photo one, we may see in photo two, and we may see in photo three. But like Rich is saying, many times from one angle, it changes, but it's in the same picture or photo number two, but it's again at a different angle. So we see these things from multiple angles to give us a better perspective of what we are attempting to put together. So, and like you said, this is like a jigsaw puzzle. You start putting the pieces together. So you'll hear Rich talk about work, from the big picture all the way down to the little picture and putting all these pieces together.
So that's exactly what we started off with. We actually start off away from the victim, all right, before we approach the victim at all, and we start looking for any potential evidence that may be in the surrounding area. Now, because we're back inside of a cave system, relatively protected from the public at that point, we're not that concerned as far as securing the area, et cetera. We had it secured topside with staff members, the state trooper, EMS personnel. We know no one else is coming down. So that we'll discuss in future shows as far as how we have to secure areas when we're in a touristy area, things like that. But on this particular one, it's pretty much secured. So after our photographs, okay, then what we do is we come back and you know what? Now we took dozens of photos, but we're only going to pick 3. We're going to kind of, add a little bit to some of these photos as we go through. So we're not talking about, 175 photos with you. So we'll pick 3 photos and that should give you enough information and, try to imagine, what's going on and what happened, the final outcome. In photo 1, first of all, the victim is dressed in a dry suit with dry gloves. Now, dry gloves have some type of a ring system that they snap in or they twist and lock into place. Keeps your hands a lot warmer, so they're not getting wet. They usually have an internal liner on them. So they got a dry suit and dry gloves on.
Right, and it appears that the victim is wearing double steel tanks with a manifold isolation valve system.
Now, what that is you've got your twin tanks. All right, you've got a valve that connects to twin tanks on that, and the isolation system means that you have a center gate valve that you can reach back and turn to isolate from one tank to another in case there's a malfunction. Right. Also, they had a wrist computer mounted on the victim's left wrist.
Right, and the victim also, it appeared that the victim didn't have a chest
sternum strap.
Sternum strap.
Yeah. And again, we're talking about some old gear, 20 years ago.
Older equipment.
Plus
right.
the equipment was, a little aged at that time.
Right.
So sternum straps weren't that big of a deal back then. Now we know that, hey, it's a lot easier on our back and shoulders, et cetera, and certainly help out a lot. Doesn't have a whole lot to do with the investigation, just something that we have to note right as we go through this.
Right.
We've got to figure it all out afterwards. Now, what I was talking about before is once we put that photo up on the dry board, the first thing we do is we have a tic-tac-toe board up there. So we have 9 zones starting in the upper left-hand corner. That's 1, right? To the right of that, adjacent to that, in the center is 2. To the right of that is 3. Then we come down to the middle 3 boxes. Then we have 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, and 9. So what we do is we start off and we only focus on zone 1. And there's usually 3 of us in the room, myself, Ed, and we usually have an equipment technician in there with us also. So we jot down and we record and we videotape everything that we're doing in that room. And we try to find everything that could be possible evidence or that could lead us to the conclusion
right.
by looking at that. Once we all agree on zone 1, all right, where we can move to zone 2, we move on to 2 and so on. Once we're done with all 9 areas, then what we do is on the projector that's projecting the tic-tac-toe image up there, that now comes down to a cross. So now we have 4 sections, 1, 2, 3, and 4, okay, starting with the upper left. And then we do the exact same thing, pretending that we never saw the picture before.
Right.
Every time we're done, before we go on to the next image as far as the diagram goes, okay, we always ask ourselves, what are we missing?
Right.
What aren't we seeing? All right. And we just focus on it a little bit. So it can take us a couple hours to go through one photo. Right. And when you've got hundreds of photos to go through,
it takes a long time.
It sure does.
Yeah.
That's the part that nobody sees,
Right.
All that tedious work.
Right. And we could be there for days.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, weeks.
Yep.
Yep. And then what we do is then that is taken off, and then we have a vertical line, right? So now we have sections 1 and 2. And then after we've done that, then we have a horizontal line, and up above is 1, down below is 2. When that's all done, we put the photo up there all by itself, and we look at it as one big picture, all right? And all the notes are taken, et cetera.
Right.
So this is kind of a synopsis, a breakdown as far as what we observed. Okay. So continuing on with photo 1, Ed talked about the sternum strap. It appears also that the victim is on his back with the feet in an upright position, so slightly elevated.
Right. And the victim appears on the floor of the cave, and his feet are elevated on one side. So he's tipped to one side, and we'll get to the reason why we believe he's tipped to one side.
All right. Also, the primary regulator has a retaining strap. Basically, what it is it's a surgical tubing that comes around the neck and is attached to the regulator mouthpiece, like just past where the zip tie, the tie wrap goes to hold the mouthpiece in place. And that's just in case you're in a restricted area and the reg comes out of your mouth. You can't get your arms up there. You can still usually kind of put your chin down and manage to get the reg back into your mouth, or it keeps it from dropping down and dangling. So it's pretty easy to recover at that point.
Right, it's nice and close to your
Right.
chin.
So they did have a retaining strap that went around.
In the primary reg, in this case, the primary reg was out of his mouth.
Yeah. And laying close by.
Right.
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 The victim's eyes were closed.
Yep. And his mask was in place. It
Right.
looked like he had a good seal around his hood. So that tells us that that he didn't have any leakage at this point. From the angle, we couldn't tell if he had a full mask, partially flooded mask, or if it was clear at this point.
All right. And again, what we're doing is we have to concentrate on the angle. We can't speculate, again, because when we get to court, we've got to testify on this. If they ask us to show photos, we've got to make sure that we only reference what we're seeing, right? The other thing is, with cave diving, you normally have a canister light, which is a rechargeable light, battery pack. Back then, canisters were quite large, right? At the end of the canister light is a toggle switch. The toggle switch has on each side of it usually a guard, all right, that's usually welded on to the canister itself, and the toggle switch fits in between those two guard plates.
Right, so it's below the guard itself.
Correct.
Right, so that you can't turn the light on or off accidentally.
Correct. You have to actually reach down in order to flip the switch. So if anything passes over the top of it, it still stays illuminated.
Right.
Right. So they had a canister light. Now, Ed and I are old school. We got trained for cave diving many, many, many years ago. And what we used to do is we would take our canister and it mounted underneath the bottom of our twin tanks. The cable then came between our legs up through our BCD, so it was secured snugly to our chest because it was behind our straps. It came out our arm, down our arm, where we had a Velcro strap also, and then we held the light in our hand, or we had a bracket for the top of our wrist.
Right.
In this case here, the canister light was mounted on the victim's right side, so just off his right rib cage.
Right.
Okay, and it was going vertical up and down. So what does that tell us as far as his body position?
Yeah, so the weight of that battery pack on his right side is going to cause him to kind of tip to that right side.
And remember at the beginning of this, we said that the victim was, even though they were on their back, they were more toward their upper shoulder, feet elevated, and slightly rolled to the right. Well, this is probably why, because of the weight of the canister light.
And it also appeared that the victim had no air in his dry suit from his waist down.
Right. We can tell that by squeeze.
By the squeeze.
Yeah,
right.
by the dry suit squeeze.
Right.
So the little amount of air that was in the suit, we could see that it was up in the lower part of the legs, which is now the high point.
Right.
Right.
Which is causing the legs to float.
Right.
Right.
So it was just above the knee, but you got to remember they're inverted a little bit. So
Right.
the air is up more toward the toe area, coming down, and it stopped just past the knee itself.
Right.
Also, the alternate air source, all right, which is the longer hose, had been deployed.
Right.
All right. Now, again, when we first became certified as cave divers, things were a little bit different back then.
Right.
And, I know that things have changed a lot over the years. And back then, 20 years ago, things were just starting to change. So it looked like they were starting to adapt to some of the new changes with their stuff. We were still diving old school.
Right.
We dove with a 10-foot alternate air source hose.
Right. And this was much shorter and put people much closer to you if the alternate air source had to be deployed.
Yeah, think about a restriction. You got to go through single file. With a 10-foot hose, if there was an equipment issue and we had to actually donate air, all right, to a receiver, what happens is the receiver leads the way. Your hose, because it's 10 feet long, is allowed to go up alongside them and into their mouth without you being at their fins or on top of their fins. It allows you to stay back a little bit.
Right.
Okay. And that way you can both egress single file.
Right. So just remember, as a kid, if you can remember back that far, just remember as a kid,
Funny guy.
when you used to play follow the leader, it's the same thing. You're egressing out of this cave system, following the leader. So just think, if that hose is too short, where are you in relationship to that person that's leading you out of the cave?
And this particular hose was 5 feet long.
5 feet long.
Yeah. So you can imagine if you've got to come out single file, which there was restrictions, and you got to come out single file, you're going to be on top of their fins, on the back of their legs, et cetera. And it's not going to be comfortable for anybody, not for the person doing the egressing that's leading the way, right, which would be the receiver of the air,
Right.
and certainly not for the donor
Right.
who's behind, because
Right.
you have to be basically up above on top of their legs now, and you're preventing them from proper kick cycles.
Right.
Right.
And think of it, like you just said, if you're in a restricted area, you're in a cave system, and if that cave system gets, that area gets smaller and smaller, and you have to follow, it's not going to be that easy.
Absolutely. Right. Also, the alternate air source came to rest 2 feet
From the victim,
from the victim's head.
right?
All
Which
right?
was still operational.
Absolutely.
Right.
Right. So 2 feet away. All right. You're starting to guess what's going on here yet? If not, we got a lot more clues for you. All right. But first, we have to take a potty break because Ed's an old guy and is, no, I'm just kidding. All right.
Okay, so from the photo, it makes me question the type of mouthpiece. It appears, and again, it appears because we're going by what we can see right now in this photo, that this is a custom mouthpiece. So think about your kids, if they play soccer or football or even now basketball, you have to have a mouthpiece. So you take the mouthpiece, you boil it, and then they put it in their mouth, and it custom forms to their bite. Okay, so that's what it appeared to us from seeing this at this angle. But we'll talk about that more as we go along.
Yeah, because we'll have a better shot of it. But
Right.
again, we're going off of basically just the photo right now.
Right.
The victim also has a pair of dry gloves on, and based on the brand, it looks like they might be brand new.
Yeah. It looked like, again, as we investigated, it looked like he may have just bought these gloves for this particular dive.
Possibly. Right. In addition, the victim appears to have a brand name dry suit, all right, that's donned.
Right.
And from the photo, it doesn't appear that the dry suit failed because we have squeeze in the dry suit. If it failed, Ed, the zipper failed, or if we had a tear in it.
Right. The suit itself is going to be filled with water. So, I mean, at this point, we know just based on the air and the feet in the angle that there was no failure to the dry suit.
Right. Also, the dry suit inflator hose comes under the victim's right arm. It's personal preference, okay? The way we dive, and again, it's personal preference only. We're not saying this is what you have to do by any means. But we have the inflator for our dry suit come over our left shoulder,
Right.
right? So the valve on our chest is facing up toward the left shoulder. Now, here's the reason that we do that, okay? And we'll try to give you reasons for everything of why we do things. If for some reason you have a stuck inflator valve and you're going to get into a possible runaway ascent, one of the things that we want to do is prevent that from happening. So to do that, we need to disconnect that. But also, as air is going in the suit, we're becoming more buoyant. And if we can't get this under control quickly, you're going to be in a quick ride to the surface, or in this case here, the ceiling.
Right.
Okay. So what happens, the reason we put it over our left shoulder is because when you bring your left arm up to disconnect that hose, the elbow's going almost straight out, even a little higher. Your exhaust valve now on your bicep is at a high point. If you just lean to the right a little bit, you can vent off that expanding air that's coming into the suit through the stuck inflator.
Right. Which is going to prevent you from that ride either to the surface or, again, in this case, in the cave system, to the ceiling.
Exactly. So this one here came underneath the right arm, so it kind of puts them in the opposite position on that.
Right.
Right. What else we got, Ed?
Let's see. You already talked about where his dry suit hose was on the right arm. His exhalation outlet was on his left bicep.
Right.
So again, you talked about that. It's
So
going to
it's
put him
exhaust valve. Yeah.
Yeah, his exhaust valve is going to put him in a awkward position.
Right. And
if
again,
he's trying to vent the air off.
And again, we had nothing wrong with the dry suit. There was no stuck inflator valve. There was no runaway ascent.
Right.
There was no failed on the dry suit. We're just talking about the position because it's telling us as investigators that, hey, maybe, a little bit more training would have been, not saying that the training was bad,
Right.
but just, that maybe things needed to be thought out a little bit more if we continue to find other issues.
Right. And this may not be an issue for people, or maybe people won't understand, but we also noticed that the right shoulder D rings were empty. Now, to the average person, that really doesn't mean much, but to you and I, during investigations, we have to look at, again, those small details.
Yeah, look and record
Right.
every little detail that we come across. So
Right.
even though some of the stuff has nothing to do with the actual fatality, we still record it all. The
Right.
second D ring from the shoulder on the right side has a brass slider, one of the dog clips that you slide down, spring loaded. And from the angle, it looked like it might have been attached to the canister light, holding the canister light in place. But again, we couldn't see that, so that's something we could not speculate on.
Right. Right.
Right.
And we also determined, again, through the photo, that the victim's mask was dry. Well, we couldn't tell from the photo, and from this particular photo, if the mask was dry, partially flooded, fully flooded, just because of the angle. And again, you're in a cave system. The lighting is all brought in, so it's hard to determine.
Yep. And as far as the left shoulder D-ring, dog clip on it, it was attached to a submersible pressure gauge. The pressure gauge came underneath the victim's left arm. And we talked earlier about the silting, the peppering. Now, remember, we have not made contact with the victim yet. We're still in the process of the photo stage. All right. So in this particular photo, you can definitely see the light peppering of silt.
Right, right. And the low pressure inflation system appears to be going okay, and the victim's primary reg appears to have an adjustable second stage.
So what that does, it adjusts the sensitivity of the breathing.
Right.
Some people like it light. When they go to inhale, they want the air right there. Some people like to draw a little bit. So that allows you to adjust the sensitivity on that.
Right, right.
Also, what we noticed is on the low pressure inflator system on the left-hand side, right, to operate your buoyancy control device, they had a piece of inner tube from a bicycle that they had mounted on it that it slid down into to keep it secured snugly to the buoyancy control device. With overhead environment diving, we don't want to have anything, let's call them danglies, whether they be hoses dangling or additional equipment dangling. You want to try to keep everything as close to and secured to the body as possible to prevent possible entanglements, entrapments, etc. So right now, they've got some of the stuff that's working well as far as secured goes to the body, and then you'll see that other stuff when we start talking about it is just kind of hanging all over the place. A little bit of both.
Right.
All right. What else you got, bud?
So you got we were unable to determine whether or not the low pressure hose is connected to the power inflation system.
And again, it's just from the angle.
Right. Just based on the body position.
Yeah. Just to let everybody know it was.
Right.
All right. But from this angle, we're focusing just on the photo. The submersible pressure gauge is not mounted in a rubber boot. Well, it doesn't have to be. It's just that if it makes impact, because it's the plastic housing on it, better chance of it breaking.
Right.
And that was attached just below the pressure gauge hose fitting.
Right.
Okay. It was attached with a dog clip right there.
Right.
All right. So that was it for photo number 1. We got 2 more that we're going to share with you before we get into the what our conclusion is right here. But hopefully you're starting to imagine, what's going on here.
Right. You're getting a visual picture of how the victim appears on the bottom.
Right. And again, if we can get enough viewers and we can start doing video reenactments, what we'll do is we'll go out and reenact all this stuff so that you can actually watch it on YouTube, or, hopefully another network gets interested.
Right.
But all right, photo 2. Once again, victim appears to be on the back with the feet elevated. Like Ed said earlier, you're going to hear some repeat because, again, it's what we see in the photo.
Right. And again, we've already discussed, there is a dry suit squeeze from the chest down that we see, again, from this same photo, like on photo number 1.
All right. The buoyancy compensator device, the BCD, is a back plate. It's secured to the victim with a standard weight belt webbing and weight belt buckle. The buckle has a right hand release. The free end is cut straight across. Couple things right here as an investigator. And again, everybody learns a little bit different, et cetera. But as an investigator, what it's telling us, the belt being cut straight across, sometimes it makes it a little bit more challenging lacing it through the buckle.
Right.
Usually they're rounded off a little bit, okay? But it's the buckle itself. Normally, when you're trained let's say we're talking mostly to recreational scuba divers out there, okay?
Right.
Even professional divers, a right hand release on a weight system, use of one hand, the right hand, so that we can go ahead and undo the belt, pull it away from our body, and eventually jettison it in order to secure positive buoyancy. In this case here, they have a right hand release on their buoyancy control device. The reason that we would normally, on this type of BC that's not Velcro or cummerbund or quick release type of a system on it, with a buckle style that's exactly like the weight belt, we usually would mount those with a left-hand release so as never to confuse that with the weight system. You don't want to think that you dropped your weight belt and you never did.
Right.
Right. Or you don't want to attempt to drop your weight belt and your BC's coming off.
Correct.
All right. So that kind of throws up a little bit of a red flag. Not really a red flag, but just a question on it. All right. Also, the victim's belly strap. To the left side of the buckle, there appears to be a utility pouch with a plastic D-ring. Nothing is secured to the plastic D-ring itself. So they have a utility pouch built into the buoyancy control device, right? Adjacent to the utility pouch is a dive knife and sheath. The knife is still in the sheath itself. The handle of the knife is facing toward the victim's chest. Had nothing to do with the actual conclusion of what happened.
Right.
But again, we're just trying to give you a visual and all the things that we need to look at and log.
Right. And on the victim's left side, his left arm from the wrist level.
No, that's waist.
Yeah,
Waist
sorry.
level, yeah.
Sorry. Waist level, it appears.
Try looking at it with your good eye.
Yeah, I know it. It appears to be the.
All right, so on the victim's left side, below the left arm at waist level, there appears to be a primary line reel and a gap reel, also known as a jump reel. You've got two reels on the left side.
Right, and it appears that the victim is slightly rolled to the right side, likely due to the weight of the canister light. So we discussed this before. So the canister light is located under the victim's right arm, which is going to put him in that on that right side, rolled slightly to that right side.
And just so everybody knows, as we approached the victim initially, there were no lights at all. The victim had been down there more than 24 hours now. And so chances are, we're assuming at that point that the light had lost power, all right, had basically burned out at that point.
Right.
All right. But there may be a surprise coming up. All right. Also, the hose mount boot facing the victim's left bicep. Again, no big deal. No apparent kinks in the alternate air source hose. This is kind of something of interest right here. It kind of tells us how they were prepared and how they positioned their alternate air source. Like we talked about earlier, when Ed and I were first getting into cave diving many decades ago, we were old school. We were taught by guru Conrad Pfeiffer out of Pennsylvania. Conrad probably one of the best cave divers I've ever met in my life. Just a phenomenal guy. So if Conrad's listening, big shout out to Conrad. Anyway, so as far as the that's concerned, we with the hose itself, with the 10-foot hose, what we did is we kind of coiled it up and down, up and down, up and down, and then took the top part of it, and it would fit into some surgical tubing that was in a loop just underneath our armpit. At the bottom loop, all right, the bottom of the hose would go in, and then the alternate air source itself would come over and be attached to our chest within that triangle area between the mouth and lower corners of the rib cage. So it's conspicuously marked, so the diver in need, can easily identify, secure, or have it handed off to them.
Right.
And then they would pull out as much hose as they need, and it would just kind of uncoil out of those surgical tubing holders on there.
Right, and almost have an S shape to it because the way it was secured in the surgical tubing.
Yeah. So if we took that out,
right,
we laid it on the ground, it wouldn't be straight. It would kind of be like a snake along the ground. Kind of have that. So with this particular hose, we just have a big arch. So what does that tell us?
Yeah, that it's been wrapped around the neck. In this case.
Yeah. So what they do now is they kind of bring it up and around their neck, and then they bring it over, and that's the regulator that they breathe off of.
Right.
The regulator that you would normally consider the primary regulator is held on with a neck ring.
Right.
Okay, that's the surgical tubing we talked about earlier. And that, if something happens now, they go ahead and give up the reg that's in their mouth, right? Bring their head down, bring the excess hose over their head. But here we're looking at a 5-foot hose.
Right.
And then they would secure their primary reg and put it in their mouth. So because of that arch, it's telling us that this is one where they had it wrapped around, all right, going up and around their neck area.
Right.
Right. One of the issues that I find with that being an old school, and again, I know things have changed a lot, but with going up and around my head, first of all, I've got to give up a regulator now.
Right.
All right. Whereas before, I kept my reg in my mouth. I gave up a donor reg, all
Right,
with a 10-foot
exactly.
hose, with a 10-foot hose on it. The other thing, bringing it up over your head, you got to be concerned about dislodging anything. Some people wear their straps underneath their hood. Some people wear it over. Preferably you wear it under, so that way your mask, it limits the possibility of getting dislodged
Right.
on you and going on the dive without you.
Right.
But it's having that high anxiety situation and now having to give up a regulator, right, and then secure another regulator,
Right.
and then work your way out. Again, just old school training. We've been at this a long time. We're both old guys.
Right.
And to give you an idea, we're both pushing 70.
Well, you're pushing 70, yeah. But again, when we look at this from this photo, the custom mouthpiece, I think we talked about this a little bit. So why don't you go over part of that as well? Because again, it appears with this custom mouthpiece that what if he does have to give this up, right?
Yeah, because which regulator is it attached to?
Right. His primary.
The reg that you would donate.
Right.
All right.
The
So in this
reg-
case, he's using that as his primary. Exactly.
Right, as his primary. But
Yep.
it's what we would consider his alternate.
Right.
Right.
So you got to think about that custom mouthpiece, like Ed was talking about earlier. Once you put it in the mouth, it's custom for your bite. In other words, it's not going to fit anyone else's mouth comfortably,
Right.
right? Because it's not designed for it. The other thing is, it was a long mouthpiece. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Remember back when, I won't say the brand, but they came when it with standard with the stock mouthpiece that went way back. I mean,
Yep.
it went way back by your wisdom teeth.
Yeah.
And,
it was so uncomfortable.
Yeah, and some people would gag on it, choke on it. It just wasn't. I mean, again, there's people that love it.
Right.
It all depends on your bite.
Right.
Personally, I didn't care for it, but a lot of people did. Obviously, this person did because it's the type that they had, but it was
Right.
adjustable. But it's not going to fit someone else's mouth perfect.
Right. So just think if that person has to use this regulator, or in this case, put this mouthpiece in, he may not seal. He may not get a comfortable bite, and he may not seal. So now, not only you're in a high anxiety situation, now you're getting water in your mouth as well because you can't get a good seal on that regulator.
Absolutely. All right. So let's go on to photo 3. I think we've given them enough clues here for photo 2.
Yeah.
On photo 3, again, brass dog clip appears at the top of the photo that was not in prior photos. We had to put that in because, again, if we end up in court and photo 3 ends up on the board and somebody goes, hey, what's that? That wasn't there before. We don't want them to think that we were messing with evidence. What that was is we had a slate that we were making notes on, and we set the slate down, and the slate had a dog clip or the sliding clip attached to it, and it ended up in the top corner of that particular photo. So that's what that was.
Right.
All right.
And the light cable leading to the canister has only one coil in it.
All right. So what happened was, instead of that canister being mounted underneath the back of the doubles, again, this is way before side mounts.
Right.
All right. What we used to do, we called them sling tanks. And we had a piece of rope that basically draped over our neck that came down with a braided loop on each end that we would put over the tank valves and then pick it up and set it up over the top. And that would be additional air that
Right.
we would carry in addition to the twin steel tanks on our back.
Right.
Now they have specialized buoyancy control devices with side mount tanks
Right.
on them. So this was way before side mounts.
Right.
And I still call them sling tanks periodically.
Yeah, that's what I call them.
Yeah. So anyway, on this light cable, it had a 4-foot cable on it. Okay. So because he had it on the right side, this cable kind of stuck out and it made a complete loop before it came off to the wrist because it was just so long.
Right.
So here we're taking effort to secure like the Super Saber light, the low pressure inflator hose on the left side, et cetera. But then we have a 4-foot looped cable that's sticking out to the right side.
Right. Goes back to the danglies that you were talking about.
Absolutely. Easy to get caught on something.
Right.
Yep. All right. What else we got here? We got a dry suit squeeze, also
Yep.
appearing in the victim's arms. Even though the victim's arms are elevated a little bit, it just happens to be once you get that squeeze in the dry suit and the victim being deceased without having any muscle to pull back, it
Right.
just happens to be the position that the suit would end up in.
Right. Right. And this puts them in, again, as we talked about throughout the show, it puts this victim in the body position because of the weight of the doubles and the weight of the canister battery on that side on the cave floor.
Absolutely. All right. What happened next is, well, let me give something away. All right. Before we tell you what happened, we had instructed everybody during our briefing that we were going to be the only ones to handle the victim as far as chain of custody. It's extremely important that we know chain of custody. And again, because if we have to go and we have to testify, we need to know who handled it, why they handled it, when they handled it, et cetera. Okay. So usually we only have specific people in our crew that will handle it or do things. In this particular case, you and I were going to be the only ones.
Correct.
Okay, they're going to handle it.
Right.
When Ed and I got to the shaft and we got to our first stage deco stop, we sent the victim up with small airbag attached to the victim.
Right.
Right. After our deco dies, we finally reached the surface. We come up and the only person there was the state trooper. Everybody else was gone. And we're like, what?
Including the victim.
Including the victim. And we can see gear strewn all around the shoreline.
Right.
What happened was when the victim hit the surface, we had an overzealous newer fireman who got anxious and said, there's one of the divers, and dove into the water, going to be the hero, and grabbed onto the victim and brought him out. And the rest of the the team of his, grabbed the victim and dragged him out, began cutting everything off of the victim, including the BC, the dry suit. Okay, everything was getting cut off the victim, and they started CPR. Person's been underwater for about 30 hours now.
Yeah.
Guess what?
He's not coming back.
Yeah, I think they're dead.
Yeah.
Right? They started CPR. So now, instead of going to the coroner like they were scheduled to, they have to, by law, go to the hospital, all right, to be declared dead by a doctor there.
Right.
Right? So that's a problem. So we come up and we are just flabbergasted. Right? So now,
I think you might have been a little angry too.
maybe a few choice words.
Well, well, I'm glad we can't mention those on the air.
Anyway, so what we're going to do next is we're going to go through the equipment itself as far as the examination of the equipment back at headquarters.
Right.
Okay. So as far as equipment inspection goes, the tanks were steel 120s. All right. The tanks also have plastic tank boots mounted on the base of the tanks. Now, I know why people do that. They do that because it's easier to stand those tanks up and self-don if they're wearing back mounted. All right. And again, they're kind of disappearing and more side mount now.
Right.
But back then, that was it. What's the issue with that?
Yeah. So with the tank boot, okay, like Rich said, it's easy to stand these tanks up because doubles are heavy.
And just if I can interject for a
Yeah,
second,
sure.
they're the octagon tank boots. So they have the little, the little corners that kind of stick out. What's the
Right.
problem with that, Ed?
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, with the tabs. So with the tabs on those boots, again, as a cave diver, you want to eliminate as many restrictions or points that can make contact or catch on to anything, either on your, going in or coming out of a cave.
Yeah, guidelines, additional cables hanging down, electrical. Right. I mean, whether it be inside of a wreck or in this case here, a cave.
Right.
If you don't need it for the dive,
don't bring it.
It doesn't go.
Right.
That's it. So we try to streamline everything. In this case here, all right, I mean, we still have the tank boots. It's not, it had nothing to do with this particular accident, just kind of a one of those other things that kind of raises the flag a little bit.
Right.
What were the tanks labeled for? Yeah,
so all the tanks were labeled for nitrox.
Yeah, but they also had partial pressure fills.
Correct.
All right, which means that they're adding O2 to hyperfiltered air, et cetera, and adding it that way rather than a premix.
Right. And during the inspection, the visual inspection was issued in May of 2003.
All right. And this accident happened in May of 2005.
Right.
All right.
And they expired in 2004.
Right. So they're a year outdated already.
Right.
Yep.
Already.
All right. Also, the tank enriched air nitrox visual inspection stickers, because they had two different inspection stickers on these tanks.
Right.
They were issued in March of 2002 and expired in March of 2003.
Right.
Right. So not quite sure who's been filling their tanks unless they were inactive as divers. And if so, why are they doing a cave dive? Right. Possibly as their first dive of the season in May.
In cold conditions.
And
right? Deep.
That's not it. We got a lot more for you. Right. The tank enriched air nitrox visual inspections, we just talked about that, expired in March of 2003. So they're 2 years outdated.
Right. And the hydro test was last done in 2002.
All right, so that's good. I mean, it's still good to 2007. This was 2005 of May.
Right.
All right, the tank valve is a Genesis dual isolation DIN manifold system. Isolation feature activated by a gate valve. All right, so that's the one that's in the middle of the manifold itself. You reach back, you can turn that. A gate, will close off and actually separate the two tanks.
Right.
Right. Hopefully, leaving you enough air if you're following the proper rules in order to get you out. Cavern diving, usually a third rule. Cave diving, especially if you're back far, you're doing stuff like that, it's usually the sixth rule. That's why we bring so much air in there.
Right. Right. And in this case, the isolation gate valve hand wheel is pointed straight up again.
All right. Again, personal preference.
Right.
It's a lot harder to reach back for a valve that's pointing straight up versus if it's coming back on a slight angle.
Right.
Kind of like following your neckline, so that when you reach back, if you reach back and you kind of feel the position of your hand, that's kind of where we want to have the valve. We don't have to want to really stretch back there. We want it to kind of reach back and have it there, so it makes it a little bit easier.
Right. And again, you're in a cave.
Yeah. And at your advanced age, with your arthritis in your shoulder and stuff, and those fingers that are all bent and crooked,
well,
it'd be kind of hard.
That's because of the situations you've put me in. That's why.
All right. All right. Continuing on, the burst discs were intact on the tanks.
Right, and that may not mean anything to many people,
but it just tells us that the tank didn't fail as far as it lost air because of burst discs. But you'll be surprised here in just a few minutes. What kind of regs were they?
Well, we won't mention the type of reg, but it appeared that both these regs were standard commercial style regs, but didn't have any type of cold water accessories or anything
features
like
on
that.
it. Yeah,
features, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
If you look at a map, all right, or globe works real good, and you look at where most of the diving in the world takes place. Okay, and I realize that there's a lot of extreme diving in cold conditions and stuff like that. But I'm talking about the majority of the dives. If we can make a wide band around that globe, most of it is happening in warmer conditions. That's where the majority of the dives are taking place.
Right.
So most manufacturers, you can imagine, hey, why should we concentrate on the small percentage of people that are diving in the northern areas or extreme southern areas of South America? Why should we focus on that when the majority of the people are going to be diving within that band?
Correct.
Right.
Right.
So in this case here, these regulators basically had no cold water features on it. The water temperature was 38 degrees.
Right.
Right. So subjected to free flow from freezing.
Right.
Okay. Both first stages that were attached to the DIN valves were on a 45-degree angle. Doesn't mean a thing. It's just they turn them that way, I'm sure, for hose preference.
Right.
Where they like the position of the hoses.
Right. And both first stage
on the DINs?
On the DINs were threaded in, and they were secured on the tank.
Yep. So they're on
tank valve.
They're on there tight.
Right.
All right. The isolation gate valve. Remember, that's the valve that's in the middle of the manifold.
Right.
That was in the open position.
Right. And the isolation gate valve does open and close, and it appears to be operational without any issues.
All right. Before we get on to the next one, Ed, what I want to do is share with the audience. As investigators, one of the things that we do before we make contact with any of the equipment or the victim itself is we, in our forensics gear that we take down, we have magnifying glasses.
Right.
All right. In this case here, one of the things that we look at, many things that we look at, but one of the things that we look at are the hand wheels. The hand wheels are the rubber knobs that people grab onto to turn their tanks on and off.
Right.
In this particular case here on the left post handrail, okay, what we noticed was rubber chafing.
Right.
Real fine that went all the way around the valve. Okay. If somebody had made contact with that and attempted to turn it on or off, chances are, more than likely, they would have rubbed it off.
Right.
Yep. But here it was, fresh on it.
Right.
So that's telling us
something
as far as.
So here's another clue for the audience. So what could have caused the chafing on this hand wheel?
In a cave situation.
Right. In a cave situation.
Or an overhead environment.
Right.
So we'll tell you a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes. All right. So the left post hand wheel above the victim's left shoulder shows signs of fresh raised rubber chafing and wear marks on the edge of the hand wheel.
Right.
All right. And we'll tell you what causes that here in a bit.
Right.
All right. What's next, Ed?
So then it also, the right hand wheel on the victim's right shoulder shows a small amount of wear.
And that was just periodic. That was
right.
just, wasn't all the way around. It was just
right.
a little bit here, a little bit there.
Right.
Right. So that tells us something also.
Right. So again, you're starting to put a picture together, or you should be starting to put a picture together of what could have caused the chafing on these hand wheels, and more on one than on the other.
And both hand wheels, when turned to the open and closed positions, worked very easily.
Right.
Simple. I mean, it was, wasn't a struggle at all.
Right.
However, when we turned the tank on, what did we find?
2,250 PSI.
That's a lot of air for a
right.
set of doubles.
Right.
Starting off at about 3,500 on these high pressure.
Right.
Still has 2,250 PSIs. Plenty of air for the egress. Plenty.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So what the heck happened?
Right.
Lights off, tanks off. Right. Because the tank was turned off. Right. So you got to think, as investigators, we got to think, was it possible foul play? I mean, we don't know. We don't know these people. We don't know the survivor. We don't know, hey, did they have a fight ahead of time? Does one person owe the other person money? Is sleeping with their wife? I mean, you just don't know. Right. So we've got to look at everything. So this is raising a huge red flag for us.
Right. And it's also preparing us for our next part of this investigation on what's causing this. Right. So we know we have to continue to look throughout, okay, what could cause this? And then we're going to get to that part.
Absolutely. All right. As far as mounted on the high pressure hose, just prior to the pressure gauge is a hose mounted dive computer. All right. This dive computer was manufactured by a company called Pelagic. Pelagic is a company that manufactures computers under many different brand names. All right. Great computer. I've used them for lots of years. This one happened to be in 1996. This is 2005, right? Computer technology has changed a lot over the years, right? Just tremendous, even from 96 to 205, right? 96, most of the computers that were out there were push button activated, which meant that prior to the dive, prior to putting pressure on the computer, you had to push the button, wait for it to cycle through. Once it cycles through, then you can descend. However, if you didn't descend within 10 minutes, it turns itself off to save on battery life. Right. What are the new computers like?
Yeah, the new computers now, so soon as you hit the water, they're water activated. They're on the remaining part of your, the entire dive, and for a duration outside. Once you egress and you're out of the water and you're going over your dive profile with your dive buddies or your dive team, that information is right there and available. Your computer's not going to turn off. Or if you're preparing to get in the water and enter the water, and a certain time period goes by, you don't have to worry, because as soon as you enter the water, your computer's turning on.
And this particular diver was diving with two computers, which is highly recommended. Right. So you have a primary computer and a backup. So if something happens, you still have backup with your information on it. All right. When we pressed the button on this computer, it went through its cycle, activated, but never recalled the last dive.
Right.
So what does that tell us?
So what's that telling you?
Yeah. It means that they might have pressed it, but
Right.
10 minutes had gone by and it shut itself off, and it was never checked prior to descent.
Right.
So the computer never logged that dive.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So now we just have to rely on, hopefully, one more computer.
Yeah, one backup computer.
Yeah, one backup.
Right.
Right. as far as the stainless steel dive right backplate, oops, I just said the right brand name. Right?
Oh.
They're not paying us for that. All right. With OMS, there we go, another one.
Boy.
Okay. Buoyancy control device with a single bladder, approximately 75 pounds of lift. Great units, all right, for back then. Right shoulder strap was cut during the victim egress. Oral inflation, power inflation, deflation devices on the BCD were all operational. 2 pieces of surgical tubing mounted to the lower portion of the backplate, possibly held from the staining that was involved, possibly held the canister light, because the canister light had 2 rings around it,
Right.
which matched up to these. So we're speculating that that's where they had it, all right, because everything matched on that. The tanks were secured to the backplate and BCD with 2 tank bands and hardware that passed through the backplate, the BCD, and bolted onto the tank bands themselves. Again, really doesn't have much to do with the conclusion of what happened. Surgical tubing was attached to the victim's right side, possibly, right, holding a longer alternate air source hose at one time, where
Right.
they had it coiled up because of the position that it was in.
Right.
Or maybe they stretched it over a canister light, but they were kind of smaller, for that. And then what do we got next here?
You might as well go on to because you were talking about the back plate before.
The Pelican light?
Yep. Where the light. Oh, you mentioned another.
Jeez, man.
We're not getting paid for any of these.
That's right. All right. So the backup light, which is attached to the right shoulder strap D-ring with brass clips and nylon string, was secured with bicycle inner tubing. So again, another piece of equipment that's secured snugly to the unit. But here we have a 4-foot hose. Here we have other danglies and stuff like that. So some stuff is good. Some stuff it's like, right. Plus we're guessing that this was probably their first dive of the season.
Right.
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 We'll tell you a little bit more about that here in a minute. But right now, it's kind of raising a flag based on what we have.
Right.
Located over the victim's left shoulder, coming off the first stage low pressure port, is the low pressure hose that's connected to the victim's low pressure inflator system. So it was connected.
Right.
Earlier on in photo 1, we didn't know.
Couldn't tell.
All right. But here we know.
Right. And again, based on the body position, and that's why we take multiple photos.
Yep. All right. The rest of that, that's not pertinent to it at all. We'll skip over that. Combination overpressure valve and manual release valve located on the left rear wing. So he had a dump valve on the BCD. It was on the lower left side, and that was operational. Yep. Right. It not only when we overflated the BCD did it burp off, but also when you pulled the string, it deflated. So that was all operational. The BCD worked flawless. Right. Actually.
And even for older equipment, it worked pretty well.
Yeah. All right. As far as the primary regulator, okay, we talked about that it had, no cold water features on it,
right?
No apparent heat retention device or sealed first stage on it. It was equipped with a standard mouthpiece that was in like new condition with a small exhalation outlet. One of the problems that we found, though, it was missing part of the front faceplate. So there was a big hole in the front of the regulator that exposed the diaphragm.
Right.
All right. I guess it's not a big deal as long as nothing pokes you in the, in that area. But if something got through the hole, it was quite large. I mean, big enough to put your thumb through there.
Right.
And, if something did come through, it's going to either poke a hole in the diaphragm or possibly dislodge the diaphragm.
Right.
But the faceplate's there for a reason.
Right. Now you're in trouble.
Yeah. It still had a purge button on it and it was working.
Right.
But the other thing is on the primary reg, it was missing. You were talking about that dial-a-breath feature, all right? The knob that adjusts the sensitivity.
Right.
It's gone in this one.
Right.
All right. So it's like, okay. So it's probably telling us it's just like their tanks. Haven't been maintained in quite a while.
Right. So so when you take a look at all the different things that we've seen through tank inspection, regs, so their equipment is telling us that this equipment hasn't been very well maintained over a number of years.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, remember when we first turned the air on to test that reg?
Right.
We couldn't get it to work.
Right.
Right. Until we depressed the purge button in several times, then it became operational.
Right.
All right. Now, what could possibly happen is because the water had a chance to evaporate at that point, the minerals that are in that particular body of water that we discovered could have stuck it closed. I mean, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt on that, but it's still telling us that as far as maintenance goes, it was certainly lacking.
Right.
Right. Now, as far as the other dive computer, all right, the other dive computer was operational.
Right.
However, because of the length of time it was submerged, we could not get information on the fatal dive.
Right.
We sent it back to the manufacturer to see if they could extract the information, and they were unsuccessful also.
Right.
But what we were able to extrapolate from it was 5 minutes from the time that regulator made contact with the water to the time they descended.
Correct.
So that tells us something huge right there.
Right.
Huge.
Right.
That we won't talk about yet. We will talk about in a few minutes.
Oh, I almost said it.
Because we're almost done here. I know people are probably falling asleep on us. Right. So let's talk about our conclusion. Right. So I'm sure if you've been listening, you're trying to put all this stuff together, trying to figure out what happened. Now, once we did our initial investigation, our forensics work on the victim, what we did is we put a marker buoy around the ankle of the victim. We sent the buoy to the ceiling. Right. We didn't know how high up the ceiling was at this point. Right. So we did a 44-foot ascent to the ceiling.
Right.
Once we got to the ceiling, right, we're at where the marker buoy is, but we know that the victim landed directly below us. So chances are, if they're heading out, all right, they started somewhere back further in the cave, which is where we started to look. We started making big circular patterns around. Couldn't do too much. We ended up doing U-shapes because we eventually hit the side wall. But we found on the ceiling.
Yeah, the area where obviously these hand wheels
were making contact. Yeah. And we could see both sides. The right side wasn't dragging as much. So it seemed like maybe the person was struggling, right? Shoulders were going back and forth. But with that alternate hose, the 5-foot hose being deployed under the arm now, so it's got to go down under the arm and back up. They're probably losing a good 10 inches to maybe a foot of hose.
Right.
So now it's even shorter.
Right.
Now this guy might as well be right on his back.
Right.
All right.
Which he's pretty close to being.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So also from the survivor saying that he kept tugging on it, and pulling, it probably pulled that shoulder down as he's pulling, allowing that hand wheel on the left post to be more exposed. And we found a longer area on the ceiling
where the hand wheel made contact
and rolled off and actually turned the guy's air off.
Right.
So
and now we go to the survivor, and he's saying, I'm tugging, and then all of a sudden,
don't give it away. We'll get there.
I almost said it.
All right, so let's just review real quick here. The victim's tanks were out of inspection, and the gas inside the tanks were at 21.5% oxygen when we analyzed it. So somebody filled this with air.
Yep.
Okay, but even though they're marked for partial pressure, if they came from the same compressor system and hyperfiltered air, et cetera, might not be that big of an issue. But in the dive industry, we kind of try to keep that separate. Partial pressure fills, et cetera. The tank still had 2,250 PSIs when examined. The regulators did not have any cold water features and appeared to be in need of maintenance. The custom mouthpiece on the alternate air source could cause a problem for anyone other than the person it was intended for. It has a custom molded bite. It's also very long. It fits deep in the mouth, compared to a standard mouthpiece.
Right. The alternate air source, again, was only 5 feet long. So if that's deployed under the right arm, again, we talked about this, it's going to shorten up the length of hose that the receiver is going to be able to have.
Absolutely. Also, the scuff marks on the left post hand wheel indicate a possible roll-off in the tank, right, on the ceiling, because as it's making contact with the stone, all right, the rock up there, it's chafing that soft rubber hand wheel.
Right, the hand wheel, right. I almost gave something away. You better go ahead.
All right. The victim, they took care to secure and streamline some of the equipment. For example, the low-pressure hose, inflator hoses, the Super Saber light, hose clamps, for the canister, et cetera. However, other equipment, such as
go ahead. I'm sorry.
The canister cable, the tank boots, and what else do we normally do in an overhead environment situation?
Yeah, so all the time we would go ahead and tape or secure the ends of our mast strap, our fin straps, anything that could catch or get caught or tangled in anything when we're in an overhead environment.
Yeah. So if you have standard type of mast straps or fin straps where you got to pull on the little tails, the little ears, like to snug it down,
Right.
we want to secure those down so that we don't get a line or a cable to go in between that.
Right.
And next thing you know, we might have a possible restricted activity.
Right.
Like that. All right. If the victim was active as a cave diver, okay, his equipment appeared to be poorly maintained and some of it was outdated. For example, the tanks were out of inspection, regulars in need of maintenance, no cold water features, and the computers were outdated.
Right.
Right.
And the gloves. What about the gloves?
Yeah.
The gloves. Go ahead.
As far as the gloves go, when we looked at the gloves themselves, they looked brand new.
Right.
What about the liner?
Yeah, the liner, there was no impressions or anything like that. So from your hands or anything like that. So this tells us again that the liners look brand new. Yeah,
there's no staining.
Nothing.
The fabric inside. Normally they'll compress down a little bit.
Right.
I mean, these things were still fluffy. I mean, I think it was probably the first dive they'd ever been on.
Right.
So it's got to tell us, those of you that have used dry gloves, they're a little different than wetsuit gloves. You know, it just takes a little bit of practice. It's not rocket science, but it's just a little bit different feel.
Right. In the dexterity.
Yeah. So
from a wetsuit glove to a dry suit glove.
Yeah, and we don't know. Did he have dry suit gloves prior to? We don't know that.
Right.
If he was diving with wetsuit gloves on and then changed over for his first dive, especially the first dive of the season. Oops, I gave it away. All right. Well, I'll tell you right now, this was their first dive of the season. Let me tell you, doing a cave dive for the first dive of the season with equipment that hasn't been maintained and using new equipment, right, is not the place to be.
Right. In a cold, deep environment.
I don't care what your certification level is or how many dives you got under your belt.
Right.
Right. It's not the place to be.
Right.
Right. You always do a dive first to make sure that you're still comfortable, all your equipment's working, equipment is maintained for your new season, and you're ready to go.
Right.
Right. The other thing is looking at the time that the computer was activated at the beginning of the descent, there wasn't enough time, for an S drill. What's an S drill? It's something other than a pre-dive safety check.
Right. Right. It's going to give you an opportunity to check all your gear prior to descending. So you're going to check, you're going to turn off those valves, turn them off, turn them on. You're going to practice that. So that's going to give you the muscle memory in case there's an issue.
You're checking your buddy for bubble leaks.
Right.
All right. You're checking to make sure that you can locate, secure, and put back your reels. Right. Primary reel, backup reel, gap reel, jump reels, whatever you're carrying for that particular dive.
Right. And in this case, they weren't using their own line reels.
That's right. We forgot to mention that.
Right.
They were following an already set in place line. Now there are two. There was one high up by the ceiling and there was one low.
Right.
All right. Which kind of, at first we were like, okay, well, they must have been following the low line.
Right.
But after further investigation, there was no other evidence on the floor whatsoever.
Right.
That there was issue. Now remember, the survivor was a certified scuba instructor. The
Not
deceased,
cave diver.
Right. The deceased is a certified cave diver.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So now with an S drill, you're doing bubble checks, you're doing line reels, you're doing backup lights also. Hey, show me your backup light. Show me you can turn it on. Let me see the brightness of it.
Right.
All right. Then you got to put it all back in order, on your own.
Right.
Then what we do is we do a touch contact drill.
Right.
We secure that longer hose, that alternate air source. Okay.
Right.
And we practice on the surface going in a single file, like we're going through a small restricted area, a single egress.
Right.
All right. And we do touch contact in case that we separate. So it's much, much different than standard recreational diving where you're doing your pre-dive safety check.
Correct.
And I'm not sure a pre-dive safety check was even done because of the equipment issues that we discovered.
Correct.
All right. So chances are neither one. Now, what's the purpose of doing the S drill on the surface?
Yeah, that muscle memory.
Right, exactly. If something goes wrong inside in the dive, we just practiced it.
And what happened? That's exactly what happened.
Absolutely. We just practiced the protocol.
Right.
We just practiced procedures.
Right.
But I'll tell you, most divers don't do it. And why?
Because it takes up too much time.
It's a pain in the butt.
Yep.
You got to put all that hose back. I don't want to take all my stuff. So they don't practice it.
Right.
Right. And listen, I was on a review committee
for years.
For 25 years. We reviewed accidents and fatalities that occurred in recreational diving. All right. We made suggestions for industry standard changes. Okay, but I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you, Ed. Most of what we investigated, okay, was just they They just failed to do pre-dive safety checks. Right. Dived beyond their limitations. We can't make suggestions if people aren't going to follow rules.
Right.
The rules are there for a reason. Right. And as investigators for 37 years, we've been doing this. Right. Been diving for eons. You got certified when? In that old leather helmet with the guys up there with the pump back and forth, right?
Yeah, I think
that's
what it was.
It was like 1868 or something like that. You were only 35 then.
It was the first diver ever.
Anyway, all right. So protocol, as far as cave diving goes, and a loss of air inside a cave system is to isolate that regulator to prevent further loss of air. You're in an overhead environment. The last thing you want to do is lose any air. This case here, they got a free flow regulator. The instructor handled it as a recreational diver would have handled it.
Right.
They let it free flow. They went up and secured another regulator and attempted to egress with the regulator still free flowing.
Correct.
Okay. Instead of reaching back, turning that off, securing your second regulator, right? Letting your buddy know that we need to exit. Right. And begin an egress with nobody as a donor and receiver. You're both coming out under your own air.
Right.
Okay. And instead, now we have a donor receiver situation with equipment problem, bubbles coming up all over the place.
Right.
All right.
Custom mouthpiece.
High anxiety. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
All right.
And again, failure to do the S drill because of, again, that muscle memory, that would help them in this situation.
All right, so let's see if we got it. All right, protocol loss in air situation. Okay, is to switch over to your secondary regulator, signal your buddy that there's an air problem and begin your egress. This is after you've isolated it. You've turned that tank off. Now, the thing with the doubles with the isolation manifold, you can reach back and turn that valve, that hand wheel that's supplying air to that regulator that's free flowing, and it only turns off that regulator. The air from that tank still goes across the manifold to the other regulator.
To the other reg.
Okay.
So you have adequate air to get to egress.
Right. Now, if you had a tank neck O-ring blow, then you have to close off that isolation valve. Right. So now you're only going out on one tank.
Right. And
that's why we use the sixth rule when you're that far back.
Right.
Okay. You want to stay longer, bring more gas.
Right.
Okay. That's all there is to it. All right. Anyway, it's my understanding that the victim's dive buddy had a problem with their regulator free flowing and secured the alternate air source from the victim. All right. The free flow regulator was not isolated. With the high anxiety situation, the dive team was now at the ceiling. People start getting nervous. They start getting high anxiety. They're breathing from the top of their lungs. Right. They'll normally have a tendency to
start to rise
a little bit.
Right.
Especially when you don't have reference points.
Right.
Okay. Start to rise a little bit. Next thing you know, boom, they're hitting the ceiling.
Right.
Right. So remember that one mark that we first found? We could see where they hit the ceiling because it was a huge area that was all scraped up. Then we followed that toward the egress and we could see where the tank valves were making contact.
Where the hand wheels were turning.
Absolutely. All right. From the position of the alternate air source hose, it was deployed under the victim's right arm, which reduced the length of the hose, causing the victim now to be too close to the receiver's fins. In an attempt to better position themselves, the victim rolls slightly to the right, causing his left post hand wheel to make contact with the ceiling and roll the valve off to a closed position. At that depth, it would have only taken 1 to 2 depths to completely deplete the air that was remaining in the hose in the second stage of the regulator.
1 to 2 breaths.
That's it.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep.
All right. So can you imagine, here you are, 456 feet back inside of a dark, cold cave system, first dive of the season.
Right.
Right. And all of a sudden, you're out of air.
Yeah.
You know you got a working regulator. It's in the other guy's mouth.
Right.
Right. So you start pulling on it.
Right.
Right.
And he's pulling back.
That's right.
Yep.
From the survivor's own testimony.
Right.
What happened? He kept pulling back.
He's pulling back. It's a tug of war.
Right. I'm not letting it go.
Yeah.
Right.
Mine, yours. Mine, yours.
All right. Now, the other thing is, on the canister light, okay, when we operated the canister light before we removed the victim, full power on the canister light.
Right.
That was because that toggle switch had been replaced at some point.
Right. It was above.
Not with a factory toggle switch.
Right. It was above the brackets that prevent that light from being turned off in any type of situation.
Yeah, accidentally. You have
Right.
to put your fingers down in there in order to turn it on or off.
Right.
Right. Now, remember what we did. We went to a pool environment. We tested it out, right, with this equipment. We tried it 10 times. And having a receiver, having the donor behind, 10 out of 10 times, 100% of the time, with that tugging back and forth, we were able to
Turn the light off.
turn the light off.
Right.
Right. So now you've got somebody who's in a out of air situation, cold, dark water, first dive of the season, right?
High anxiety.
No light.
Right.
Right.
Pitch black.
456 feet back in a cave system that I don't know if they're familiar with or not.
Right.
Okay.
Because we weren't familiar with it because we were traveling there.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Absolutely. All right. So just a horrible situation. Now, as far as the victim, how they landed, okay? So the survivor says, hey, the hose was going straight down and I just couldn't hold on to it anymore.
right.
Yeah, unfortunately, what happened at that point?
Yeah. The donor, in this case, the victim, had already
Drowned.
passed away.
Yeah,
right.
he drowned.
Drowned.
And he's starting to descend.
Right.
Right.
His
Lungs are off gassing.
are off gassing.
Yep.
And the
He-
hose is getting shorter because he's pulling it down
Yeah,
with
he's
the weight
kinda-
of his body.
Kind of swinging right underneath the survivor.
Right.
Right. And there he is.
And there he is. So
Right.
he's
Just hanging there. Can't hold on to it.
right. Survivor's like, okay, I'm done.
Managed to get his free flow regulator back.
Right. I'm letting go of this reg, and I'm getting out.
Yep. And managed to get back to the shaft. All right, swimming like a madman. So
Right.
there's high exertion
Right.
with it, which is a contributing factor to DCS. Also, cold
Right.
conditions,
Right.
et cetera, rapid ascent.
Yep.
And he said he ran out of air on the way up.
Yeah.
So he basically did an ascent with no air.
Right.
I'm not sure from what depth he did it from, but
Right.
he said he ran out of air on the way up. But anyway, so as the victim passes away, okay, the weight of the steel tanks is going to roll them over.
Right.
Okay, because they're going to descend first.
Right.
All right. And because they're on the upper half of his body, it's going to drop his shoulders down a little bit.
Right.
Boom, makes contact with the bottom. All right. And then slightly rolls to the right.
Because
And
of the weight of the canister,
canister light itself.
Right.
And what comes resting 2 feet from his head?
his primary reg.
A working regulator. The
Right.
primary that he was breathing off of, which in their case was also the alternate air source,
Right.
came resting right next to his head with 2,250 PSI still available.
Right.
Sad.
Yeah. Very sad.
And when there ended up being a civil suit with this, all right, because the deceased family sued the survivor, and in court, you got to go through this all again and explain what happened,
Right.
and was found guilty of wrongful death. And why were they found guilty? Because it was a certified scuba instructor who should have known better.
Right.
They were not certified as a cave diver. They did not practice what they preached.
Correct.
They did not follow standard of safe diving practices.
Right.
They did not follow protocol.
Right.
Right. They did not follow procedures and protocol for cave diving.
Well, for
Instead-
any overhead environment.
I don't need it. I'm an instructor.
Right.
Okay. So in this case here, found guilty
Right.
on that. So sad.
Yeah. Very
Sad.
Yep. That's for sure.
Anyway, we know this was a long one. We appreciate everybody listening and hanging in there. We hope this kind of opened your eyes a little bit as far as what we went through for many, many decades. Some of the investigative techniques. Now, there's a lot more to it. And again, we crammed this down into 3 photos that we added, a little bit more to information to, and kind of gave you a quick synopsis of what was going on and a quick, conclusion. But overall, I mean, this took weeks and weeks and weeks of investigative work.
Right. And we look forward to everybody coming back and listening to our next podcast, our next episode.
You know what? For the next one, Ed, we're going to do an insurance fraud investigation.
Oh, that's a good one. Yep.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
we've done a number of those. So
Hundreds. All right. Actually, it was the insurance fraud that was our bread and butter.
right.
All right. That's what basically paid the bills.
Yep.
In this case here, it was a vessel.
Yep.
Okay. A potential crime scene. And, from our investigative work, we were able to prove
That
without a shadow of a doubt that
it was insurance
that
fraud.
it was insurance fraud.
Yep.
Oh, you just gave it away.
No, you already did.
So it's a good one. Won't be as
Yep.
long as this one, but it's a good one.
Yep.
Hey, listen, we thank you for listening, and please, like and share. Tell everybody you know. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your fellow divers. If you didn't like it, keep your mouth closed. Right? And we appreciate it. On behalf of Senior Investigator Ed Miron, I'm Rich Morin, and thanks for listening. Underwater CSI International.
Revealed.
On behalf of everyone at Underwater CSI International, Revealed, this is Randy Overton. Thank you for tuning in. Underwater CSI International Revealed is for entertainment purposes only. The information revealed is not intended, nor is it a substitution for the proper training and education received from a qualified dive professional. Certain episodes are loosely based on and may be modified from actual cases. Some episodes are fictional based, featuring procedures that could possibly be used by underwater investigators. Resemblance to destinations, actual cases, or persons living or deceased is purely coincidental.